Before the sun has fully finished yawning, the heat is already doing its best to melt your resolve. You wake to an oven that never cools, to air that smells of Nile mud and something like incense and old sweat. Today, you are going back to ancient Egypt for 24 hours, and by the time we finish, you will understand why no sensible person would last a day without a tribe, a permit, and a miracle. This is not a romantic picnic with pyramids in the background. This is a sensory interrogation of how ordinary life became extraordinary under a sky that had gods in its corners. We will travel from waking to ritual, to the markets, to the work at the edge of empire, and to the ruins of a temple that still manages to make modern experts uneasy. If you enjoy time travel with a side of grim practicalities, hit like and tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Now dim the lights a little and put on a fan or a small noise that sounds like a river so that your sensorium leans toward the ancient. I promise discoveries, a few insults to your modern assumptions, and at least one scene that will make you uncomfortable in a deliciously inquisitive way. Now open your eyes. It is morning by the river, and someone is calling your name. You are a person with chores, debts, and a household. Your name depends on which town you are from, but your situation is all too familiar. You wake on a mat woven from reeds in a small house pressed close to others like ribs in a chest. The floor is packed mud and straw, cool only for a moment before the sun finds it. In the corner there is a clay lamp blackened with soot that smells of sesame oil and resin. The water jar is heavy, and the rope that lifts it creaks the way a tired animal does, and you think briefly about bargaining for more shade. Outside, a boy runs barefoot, calling the news of the day like a wandering radio. Women turn big grinding stones to a rhythm that is almost musical, and the smell of flatbread and lentils rises. You exchange a polite, curt salutation with your neighbor, and then you are out into the alley that smells of fish and papyrus. For a moment, everything is normal, which is precisely what makes the next details invasive. The sun pricks through the reeds, and a fly the color of iron lands on the brim of your eye and refuses to leave. 5 things will make it impossible for you to last a day here without collapsing, leaving, or being processed into some form of communal pity. We will go through each one with evidence, human voices, and the kind of scientific tests that make modern certainties look flimsy. Reason 1 is the climate that is not an accessory but a persistent.
Imagine heat not as background, but as an active editor of behavior, law, and taste. You sweat before your sandals finish the second courtyard. Your clothes are linen that breathes, but breath has its limits. The sun makes your skin porous, and your jars sweat salt. The wind that soothes is the same wind that strips moisture from grain and carries dust that gets into eyes, throat, and argument. You will learn quickly which parts of the workday you can survive and which you cannot. By late morning, markets are a chorus of bargaining voices. The voice of a scribe reading a list aloud, the clack of wooden tools, and the metallic ring of small bronze as traders count out wages. A vendor named Kemet sells pottery with crackled glazes and tells you with a sly smile that the best jars are older than your mother's stories. A woman who goes by Hatshepsut smooths clay with practiced fingers and cautions you about the river fish that swim near the reed beds. You meet an apprentice named Nebu who is fascinated by obsidian fragments because they are windows into distant mountains. A boatman called Sufi explains where the current hides shoals that break oars and spoils cargo. A temple attendant, Ameni, keeps a small box of amulets and offers you a protective token with a wink that suggests payment with labor. These names will reappear in different roles because people here wear many hats and obligations. Dialogue in the market is not theater. It is negotiation and ritual rolled into one. Listen to an exchange that could decide your lunch. 4 rounds of back and forth will show you the economy and the etiquette. Kemet says, You want this pottery? It is good work from the south, and it holds oil well. You ask, how much? He says, 10 small pieces of silver and a chicken. You balk and propose 5 and 2 loaves. Kemet laughs and says, the jars do not grow on papyrus trees. You counter, they look chipped. I will pay 7 and a loaf of bread. He leans in and says, you bargain like you are already starving. The deal will be 9, and you carry the charm that marks you as honest. This is the rhythm of living. Each reply is a measure of trust, risk, and social credit. Listen to the textures around the dialogue. The clap of sandals on packed earth, the scent of cumin and frying onions, the far-off oar slap, the rustle of linen in the shade, the metallic tang of copper counting pieces. In the middle of this ordinary bartering, you are reminded that economy is not an abstraction here. It is present as taste and smell, as hunger, and as the way a thumb rubs a coin. Reason 2 is water and its politics. Water is abundance and scarcity folded into one. The Nile gives and it takes. Boat traffic is a kind of public transport.
Service and funeral route all at once. The same river that brings mud for bricks brings crocodiles and disease. There are rules about whose boat gets priority and which boats must wait for ritual clearance. You overhear a conversation between a canal official named Passer and a boat owner named Miri that has the texture of legalese without a manual. Passer says, "Your boat passed when the sun crossed the mark. You know the rule." Miri replies, "I thought the reeds were taller today and the marker was obscured." Passer asks, "Did you not send a signal?" Miri answers, "I did, but the wind took it." Passer says, "Then you will owe grain and wait." Your reply is an apology that is also a promise of labor. The canal taxes are not merely tithes, they enforce social order. The water brings silt that buries pottery and seals and creates a chronicle in its sediments, but also brings insects whose breeding grounds are reed fields where children play. The interplay between flood and agricultural calendar shapes everything from when you marry to when you bury an elder. Reason 3 is work and vulnerability under structures of power. Labor is stratified not only by job but by ritual status. Your day will likely include a combination of domestic chores and a public task. You may find yourself hauling mud for brickmaking in a crew led by a foreman named Bikek, who carries a stick not just as proof of office but as a symbol of decision. You speak in the kind of short sentences that soften an insult into procedure. In a work scene of 4 to 6 exchanges, you see how authority is enforced and how people resist. Beck says, "Stack the bricks with corners tight and let the mortar cure." You ask, "How long today?" He replies, "Till the sun hits the low palm." Then he adds, "Bring the child to watch." He says, "No, that is not for children." The boy protests, "But I can carry a light load." Beck answers, "Practice when you can carry more." Beck frowns and says, "If you drop one, you will be fined." The conversation is practical and brutal. The sensory reality is elements that bind the scene. The grit that lodges in the throat, the wet coolness of the clay between fingers, the sun making your temple muscle ache, the thud of formed bricks meeting the ground, the scent of wet mud and drying straw. Alongside work, there are obligations of status. The temple consumes labor and attention in ways that feel like devotion and taxation at once. The iconography carved on lintels marks who paid and who toiled, and the seals impressed on jars indicate ownership and obligation. Your name may be listed in an accounting text. That list is a form of social memory and also a kind of debt ledger. If you are lucky, you might secure a small piece of bronze or an amulet that changes your standing in subtle but real ways. There is a backstory to your hunger to advance and to the choices that made you who you are. It is the story of survival shaped by lineage and chance. To understand you, we need a backstory. Your childhood was a series of halted ambitions and practical reckonings. You were born along a canal where reeds made a soft curtain between houses and where the river leveled the world into a pattern of seasons.
Your father was a boatman who knew stars and tides and taught you to read the water by sound. Your mother ground grain for a living and memorized the prices and prayers that held the household together. They argued about risk and savings and about whether a child should learn a craft or be apprenticed to a scribe. You learned to carry things long before you learned to read. You learned that small favors can accumulate into protection. You watched a sibling leave for a city with hopes and return with a limp and a silence that suggested knowledge gained at the cost of something else. The second paragraph of your backstory reveals the moral calculus that shaped choices. You learned to tell time by the work of others and not by stars. Alone, you watched storms take roofs and the charity of kin decide shelter. The third paragraph explains a formative event. A festival changed your trajectory. A visit to a temple where ritualized bodies lay in display, and where an old priest named Iset gave you a token to keep and told you stories of a goddess who protected honest labor. The token did not make life safe, but it made you believe in luck and in the language of protection. The fourth paragraph ties you to the present. The last years have been leaner. The harvests are less forgiving, and the river behaves in ways that make elders whisper new words about climate and curse the heavens. These lines total roughly 900 characters, and they are meant to give you a personal anchor amid the structures we will examine. Reason 4 is belief and ritual and how they organize daily life into a calendar of obligation. Religion here is not a private meditation. It is a public machine, an infrastructure of meaning. You will be expected to offer small items each morning to deities that are also administrators of weather and fertility. A ritual scene will have its own choreography and a technical explanation of the ceremony that is granular and procedural. The priestess Iset performs the ritual at dawn with a rhythm that is a mix of poetry and inventory. She lifts a bowl of beer, offers a small piece of bread, and recites names that, in the ear of a modern listener, sound like lists of commodities. The ceremonial procedure includes measurement of offerings, burnt incense, and the precise alignment of a small statue toward the point where the sun will rise.
On a certain feast day. Process explained. An offering ritual requires the precise counting of grain or oil, the selection of a purified container, the recitation of prescribed names, and the placement of the object on the altar in a specific order. The ritual acts both as devotion and as a civic ledger. It documents who gave what and when, and it binds recipients to responsibilities. These sentences give you a technical sense of how ritual functions in practice. Religious belief shapes risk and punishment and gives power to a few who control the narrative. The iconography of gods and the inscriptions on temple walls are not decoration. They are claims about legitimacy. In the courtyard of a temple, you will hear a conversation between Ameni, the attendant, and the scribe Ptolemy about a new inscription that needs to be carved into the stone. Ameni says, "The inscription must credit the harvest to the goddess and not to the merchant." Ptolemy replies, "If we alter the text, we alter who pays the offering." Ameni answers, "They already paid, and the record needs updating." Ptolemy asks, "Who authorized this change?" Ameni says, "The overseer signed it. That is enough." The dialogue shows how texts are instruments of power. Sensory notes anchor the scene. The smell of burnt cedar, the texture of sandpaper rubbing away a draft, the taste of sour beer on the tongue, the muffled call of a peddler outside, the cool shadow under the column. Reason 5 is death and the management of bodies, which is at once intimate and bureaucratic. People here die as everywhere, but arrangements blend spiritual practice with practical sanitation. A ritualized body might be anointed and dressed, with amulets, placed in a reed shroud, and set in a tomb with offerings. Sometimes the body is preserved by circumstance, and sometimes the remains appear in positions that tell stories of sudden catastrophe. For archaeologists, the way bodies are arranged is evidence. A body with a seal on the wrist, a string of beads, and a pottery shard tells a different narrative than bones collapsed in a doorway. You will encounter a small forensic analysis of remains that clarifies age at death, markers, trauma, and burial practice. Forensic analysis.
Forensic work combines bone assessment with context and isotopic tests to determine diet, illness, and sometimes cause of death. Techniques include measuring bone wear, looking for lesions, and cross-referencing findings with burial goods and inscriptions. These explanations give you the way science reads a life. Now we reach the archaeological thread that pulls the modern world into this narrative. Some years ago, field archaeologists were excavating a town on a bend of the Nile when they found a sealed room under a private house. The excavation revealed pottery fragments, a small stash of obsidian tools, and a handful of amulets next to what appeared to be ritual offerings. The stratigraphic context was complex, with layers of ash and reed matting that suggested a sudden event.
At the site, a team led by Dr. Miriam Solomon and her colleague Dr. Idris Al-Fayek documented the find. Hear them speak in a detailed exchange that shows the labor behind discovery. Dr. Solomon says, "We have a sealed context and a clear stratigraphy." Idris replies, "The pottery typology places this in a shorter chronology, and the amulets look like household protection." Dr. Solomon asks, "Were there signs of fire?" Idris answers, "Some ash, but no uniform burning." Dr. Solomon says, "Then we must consider flooding or ritual abandonment." Idris says, "We need samples for carbon dating and microstratigraphic analysis." Dr. Solomon replies, "Take samples from the beam and from the reed mats and label them carefully." This dialogue with 5 exchanges shows how evidence is negotiated between experts. Sensory additions to the excavation scene are immediate. The metallic smell of tools, the powdery taste when you inhale dust, the echo of brushes on clay, the slight warmth of sun trapping heat in a trench, the sight of pottery painted with a dull red slip. A technical procedural note on excavation is required to show how evidence becomes knowledge. Excavation procedures include careful grid mapping of the site, recording the stratigraphic context, and photographing each layer before removal. Soil is shifted with trowels and brushes, sieved through meshes, and samples taken for flotation and radiocarbon dating. All items are logged with provenience coordinates and then conserved in a lab. This explanation spans about 300 characters and gives you a compact view of field methods. Within the discovery, there is a sealed jar that contained a small scroll-like object and a set of inscriptions that did not fit neatly into cataloged hieroglyphs. An epigrapher named Layla deciphers a few signs while an epigrapher assistant named Omar takes rubbings. Their exchange follows the methodical back and forth of scholarship. Layla says, "This sign repeats, but not in any grammatical place." Omar replies, "Could it be an archaic variant?" Layla asks, "Or a local dialect?" Omar answers, "We should compare with texts from the Delta." Layla says, "And consult the iconography on the pottery." Omar replies, "I will fetch the catalog." This short dialogue with 4 solid turns reveals the painstaking attention of language work. The inscription hints at protective language and a list of offerings that includes an item you may recognize as an offering of beer and a sealed token stamped with a seal that represents a minor official. The analysis moves into laboratories where samples are tested for chronology and composition. A dry and slightly sarcastic scientist named Dr. Patel runs through the tests with a technician named Hana. Dr. Patel says, "The carbon dates will give a range, not a point." Hana asks, "How narrow can we go?" Dr. Patel replies, "With good samples and calibration, we can get within a few decades." Hana asks, "That still seems wide." Dr. Patel answers, "History is patient, and so must we be." This exchange of 4 to 6 lines shows the conversational cadence between lab staff. The lab itself smells of solvents and clean paper. The hum of centrifuges provides a steady beat. The small LED screens blink with spectral lines, and the technician's breath fogs the air near the cooler where samples wait. The scientific analysis reveals a puzzle. The pottery and the seals suggest an ordinary household. The inscriptions suggest ritual protection, and the stratigraphy records episodes of ash that do not correlate perfectly with carbon dates. Alternative hypotheses are posed, including a ritual burning, a localized accident, or an intrusive ash layer from a distant campfire carried by wind. The implications are political, because if the ash corresponds to a known campaign, then the site changes its relationship with a regional power center.
A public discussion follows with an archaeologist named Dr. Hassan and a local official called Mayor Farouk. Dr. Hassan says, "If this ash is campaign debris, then the chronology shifts." Mayor Farouk replies, "That would change who we say ruled this region." Dr. Hassan asks, "Are you prepared for that?" Mayor Farouk says, "The narrative of the city needs stability." The conversation brings to life how discoveries reshuffle present-day identity. Sensory details anchor the debate. The smell of strong coffee in the municipal office, the creak of a swivel chair, the dry texture of official paper with stamps, the murmur of villagers outside, the dense air that carries both dust and expectation. Tension arrives in two extended moments that are both human and political. Moment 1. A crowd gathers when the news of the find goes public. The mood is one part curiosity, one part fear. The public wants artifacts returned to the town, but the law requires export for conservation. The two paragraphs here each run about 500 to 600 characters, and show the pressure cooker that follows when archaeology meets community. People chant asking for relics that they say belong to their ancestors. Officials warn of damage to fragile items, and experts suggest replicas could satisfy both needs. The tension crescendos into a night where someone tampers with a trench. Nothing is stolen, but a few fragile pots are cracked, and a smear of mud across a draw is left as a message. The scene smells of smoke and wet clay, and panic is a tactile thing that makes hands shake. Moment 2. An argument between a traditional priestess and a modern curator escalates into a debate about meaning. The priestess sees the objects as living relics and demands ritual handling. The curator insists on cold preservation. The paragraph length again is 500 to 600 characters. The priestess speaks of guardian spirits and the curator speaks of preservation matrices. Neither yields easily. The compromise is ugly and instructive. The scene leaves the reader with the sense that heritage is contested in the present as much as it is recovered from the past. Beyond local controversy, the discovery invites larger questions about technology and connectivity. How did people move obsidian across long distances? How did iconography travel and mutate? How did alignment with stars inform building practices? The town's temple shows an architectural plan that aligns with an astronomical alignment, linking a particular door to the rising of a star used as a seasonal marker. This suggests a sophistication in chronology and planning that ties religion to agriculture and to political legitimacy. Comparative notes place the town in a wider map of trade routes and cultural echo. The reed fields at the edge of the town are similar to those described in texts from another delta settlement, and the pottery shares patterns with a group several hundred kilometers away. These connections show that no community was fully isolated and that practices traveled as goods did. We return to the human scale and to the consequences of belief and of bureaucracy. The archival evidence shows that after the find, a petition circulated asking for locals to be trained in conservation and to have a say in the display of artifacts. A meeting convened at the town council and people spoke. Characters named Lila, the schoolteacher, Mustafa, a retired mason, Nefert, a young potter, and Yusef, an elder who remembers a story about a shrine, each present perspectives. Their voices in short exchanges reveal the variety of stakes. Lila says, "We should take this to the school." Mustafa replies, "We need training and jobs." Nefert asks, "Will they repatriate the pottery?" Yusef says, "The ancestors need respect." The dialogues are short but real, and they map a social negotiation. Sensory touches linger. The chalk dust on Lila's hands, the sawdust from Mustafa's bench, the soft clay on Nefert's fingertips, the creak of Yusef's cane. At roughly 1/3 of our journey, it is time to ask you a question and to invite you in. If you are sitting there wondering why some discoveries return to the towns that birthed them and others end up in distant museums, you are not alone. Tell us in the comments what discovery you would want to see unearthed live, and start your answer with the name of a town. For example, Luxor pottery. We read your responses and they guide future investigations. Your voice matters because archaeology is not just for experts. It is for communities, for descendants, and for curious strangers who want to understand how the past shapes the present. Now we move to the final third of this exploration where method meets meaning. The conflict over heritage escalates to public policy. A provincial council debates legislation to protect sites and to require local representation in research decisions. The arguments are legal and moral. A legislator named Hani argues for strict export controls, while a provincial economist named Rana worries about lost tourism revenue if artifacts remain locked in small-town displays. The debate is technical and practical. Procedures for exporting artifacts include documentation, proof of conservation, and agreements on loans to museums. The legal
process often requires committees and delays that frustrate both scholars and locals. The sensory texture of policy debate involves the rattle of pens, the scent of printing ink, and the slow tick of a public clock. In a broader perspective, the town's experience links to questions of technology adoption and cultural adaptation. The way pottery styles change as new techniques appear shows a responsiveness to trade and to fashion. The presence of obsidian suggests networks that brought sharp tools across distances. Iconography morphs as communities selectively adopt symbols that reinforce local leaders. Material culture thus becomes a conversation across time. The narrative connects this town to other sites where reed-based economy and astronomical alignment shaped planning and ritual. The final block is about legacy and time. We have to close with an epilogue that tracks concrete changes at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months after the discovery. 1 month later, the site is secure with covers and a small local team trained in basic conservation practices. There are guided visits that bring a modest income and a sense of pride. The town hosts a workshop on pottery repair, and the school arranges for students to see replicas. The immediate mood is one of cautious optimism and a feeling that something of value has returned to the community. In 3 months, a traveling exhibition, curated with input from locals, tours a nearby city showing selected items and reproductions. There are critical articles in national newspapers that debate narratives about heritage and history. The exposure brings both tourists and critics and spurs a public conversation about who owns the past and what history should teach. There is also pressure to regulate antiquities and enforce stricter excavation permits. 6 months on, a policy agenda has shifted in a modest way. New guidelines require community consultations and training programs for site monitors. There are still disagreements, and the museum world pushes back, but the balance of power has shifted slightly toward inclusion. The epilogue shows that history does not freeze discoveries into a single story. Instead, it unfolds and is folded back into local lives. Before we end, a few final technical observations. The excavation recovered pottery shards with traces of organic residue that suggest the jars stored beer and oil. The obsidian flakes show tool marks consistent with fine engraving. The inscriptions include a repeated protective phrase, and the seal matches administrative types found in neighboring regions. A small set of amulets were found placed in a deliberate pattern near a threshold, suggesting a household ritual for safe passage. These technical notes help us move from feeling to evidence. In summary, what would make it impossible for you to last a day in ancient Egypt is not a single overwhelming monster, but a cluster of realities that together compress modern assumptions into smaller shapes. The heat will press against your lungs and patience. The water will carry rules and risk. The work will teach you the grammar of authority. Belief will shape who you are allowed to be, and death will be handled in a way that is at once tender and bureaucratic. The archaeological record proves these points in shards and seals, in ash, and in the arrangement of bodies and offerings. If you liked this journey, subscribe to explore more stories where evidence meets human lives. Share with a friend who likes messy historical truths, and come back for the next deep dive. Remember, when you look at an ancient jar, you are not only seeing clay, you are seeing choices, obligations, and the small acts that hold a society together. And if you ever think a day at the beach is hard, try a day where the sun is a ruler and the river keeps accounts.